Have you ever noticed how certain types of businesses just seem to pop up everywhere almost overnight?
Mm.
Like one day there are a few independent garages, the next they've all got the same branding, maybe the same website.
Yeah, where those little local shops you
Yeah.
suddenly disappear, replaced by something,
Yeah,
well, less local feeling.
exactly. It gets you thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Are these businesses that look independent actually part of some, bigger hidden network?
That's precisely the question we're digging into today. And
Okay.
it's fascinating because, well, this isn't your typical huge merger story that hits the news.
Uh-huh.
There's this quieter trend, but it's really significant. Private equity roll-ups. Think of it as consolidation, but more under the radar.
Stealthy consolidation.
Exactly. So the key thing for you listening is the marketplace might look diverse, but it could be way more controlled than you realize.
Stealthy feels like the right word because,
Right.
everyone spots the massive corporate buyouts.
Right.
But these roll-ups, they happen bit by bit, gradually. And that's what this deep dive is really focusing on.
We've pulled together a bunch of recent analyses, some case reports from competition authorities, plus some really revealing news pieces from the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, good stuff in there.
So our mission today is basically to figure out how these roll-ups actually work, why they've managed to, well, avoid getting flagged by regulators for so long, and what it all means for you, the listener, and for the economy generally.
Right. We want to give you a clearer picture of the forces shaping the businesses you interact with, maybe even daily.
Okay, so let's get into the heart of it, this stealth trend of serial acquisitions.
So yeah, starting around the 2010s, maybe a bit earlier in some cases, firms backed by private equity started systematically buying up lots of smaller competitors.
Uh-huh.
They target what are called fragmented industries.
Okay, fragmented industries, you mean sectors where there are just tons of small independent businesses, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe local vets or dentists.
Exactly that. Lots of small players. And the key thing, the really crucial point, is these aren't the flashy mega mergers.
No headlines. No headlines. It's a whole series of smaller acquisitions, often carefully structured to fall below the dollar amounts that trigger mandatory reporting to antitrust agencies.
Ah, okay. So like lots of small bites instead of one huge one.
Precisely. Many small bites.
So what kinds of businesses are we actually talking about here? It sounds like it could be quite widespread.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah.
The sources show it's across a surprisingly wide range. Healthcare's a big one. Dental practices, vet clinics, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Even the companies that supply doctors to emergency rooms.
Wow.
Then you see it in retail pet stores, for instance. Even those third-party sellers on Amazon. Some of those dominant ones are actually part of roll-ups.
No kidding. So they're not just small independent sellers.
Not always, no. Some are part of larger holding companies.
Right.
Then you've got funeral homes, insurance brokers, auto parts dealers, retirement homes. The list goes on.
Huh.
The common factor is that many seem like local independent businesses that you, as a consumer, probably assume are independent.
Right. But they might be owned by some faceless conglomerate miles away.
That's the potential reality. And it means less local control, maybe fewer genuinely independent choices for you.
Okay, that definitely makes you think. So how are they managing to pull this off without, setting off all the antitrust alarms?
Well, there are a few key tactics they use. A really central one is using holding companies and these things called private equity platform firms.
Okay, explain. Platform firm.
So imagine a private equity fund creates a main company that's the platform. Then that platform company goes out and acquires smaller competitors, one after another.
Mm-hmm.
And it essentially tucks these acquisitions underneath its umbrella structure.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is critical, the actual businesses, the ones you see on the street, they often keep their original names, their branding.
Ah, so it creates this illusion that nothing's really changed, like it's still Bob's local dentistry.
Exactly. From the outside, it looks like business as usual, keeps customers comfortable, avoids attention.
Makes sense. What else?
Another huge tactic is focusing on serial acquisitions below thresholds. We touched on this. In the U.S., you've got the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, the HSR threshold.
Right.
If a deal's value is below a certain amount, it was around $111 million
Right.
in 2023. You generally don't have to formally notify the government beforehand.
Okay.
Canada has a similar threshold based on the size of the parties involved, roughly under $93 million for the deal size.
And these thresholds were meant for big mergers, right? Not lots of little ones.
Precisely. They were designed to catch deals big enough to potentially impact national markets right away. Roll-ups exploit this by making sure each individual purchase stays under that limit, even if they buy dozens of companies over time.
Yeah, I see. If each one looks insignificant on its own, it avoids the automatic review. We actually have a quote here from FTC Chair Lena Khan about this.
Oh, yeah.
She said these roll-up strategies are often, quote, executed through a series of smaller acquisitions in which each may fall below the dollar threshold that triggers reporting to federal antitrust agencies.
That nails it. And what helps them get away with this is how market fragmentation provides cover.
How so?
Regulators, historically, were really focused on mergers between already large companies, number two buying number three.
Right, the big fish.
Exactly. They weren't really geared up to track the slow, creeping consolidation of many tiny players in industries full of mom-and-pop shops. So a holding company could buy dozens of local businesses, but the overall industry might still look pretty fragmented, at least on paper, for a while.
And funding all this buying, it must cost a fortune. Where does the money come from?
That's where debt and private capital fuel comes in. Private equity funds provide the capital, often using a significant amount of borrowed money or debt. Their goal is usually to build up the market power of their platform company pretty quickly, make it dominant, and then sell it off later for a much higher price.
And the potential downside for consumers there is.
Well, once they have that market power, the pressure is on to deliver returns. That can mean more aggressive tactics, raising prices, cutting services, reducing staff, things that boost profits but might not be great for you.
Right. Got to pay back that debt and make a profit for the investors. I also see a note here about avoiding integration. What's that about?
So initially, at least, the holding company might keep the businesses they buy as legally separate entities or distinct brands.
Okay.
This can make it harder for regulators to see it as one big consolidating move.
Yeah.
They can argue, oh, we're just an investment firm managing separate businesses.
Clever.
It is. But it's important to add, authorities are now starting to say they'll look at the totality of these deals. They're getting wise to the fact that lots of small deals can add up to a big problem.
Okay, so it's like they're building this huge jigsaw puzzle, piece by piece, hoping nobody notices the full picture until it's done.
That's a good way to put it.
And by then, it's potentially much harder for regulators to step in and do something about it. Okay, so we have these tactics. Platform companies staying below thresholds, using fragmentation as cover. Let's make this concrete. How about that 123 dentist case in Canada? Sounds like a perfect illustration.
Oh, it really is a textbook example. 123 Dentist started small, just one clinic, I think, and then backed by private equity firms like Peloton Capital Management, later KKR, big names they grew by partnering with and just acquiring dental practices all across Canada.
Right.
By 2022, they had something like 250 clinics. And here's the kicker. Most of those individual acquisitions, too small to trigger a mandatory review by Canada's Competition Bureau.
So they just kept adding clinics under the radar.
Pretty much. It wasn't until they announced a major merger with two other big dental groups, Ultimate Dental and LaPointe, creating this network of nearly 350 clinics, that the sheer scale became undeniable.
And what happened then? Did the regulators step in?
Well, the Bureau reviewed that big merger, but ultimately they cleared it. They didn't block it.
Wow. So the consolidation went ahead. And the potential impact for you, the listener, fewer independent dentists, maybe less competition on price or service.
That's the concern, yeah. Fewer truly independent options.
It's just wild to think that all those different dental offices you might see around town could actually be part of this one huge network and you'd have no idea. And this isn't just happening in Canada, right? The sources mentioned similar stuff in the U.S., Heartland Dental, Aspen Dental.
Absolutely. In the U.S., you have these big dental support organizations, DSOs they're called. They've also grown by quietly buying up hundreds and hundreds of individual practices. Again, mostly flying under that HSR reporting threshold. So yeah, you've seen this huge shift in dentistry in both countries, away from the traditional solo practitioner towards these large investor-owned chains.
And often without much antitrust pushback until maybe recently.
Right. And that consolidation can potentially mean, less personalized care if decisions are being driven more by corporate targets than individual patient needs.
Okay, let's switch gears but stay with things people care about. Pets. The consolidation in vet clinics and pet insurance seems, well, pretty massive too. JB Holdingcom sounds like a major player.
Yeah, this is another really telling case study. JB is actually a European private investment firm, but they've been incredibly active in the U.S. pet care market. They went on a huge buying spree vet clinics, animal hospitals, even pet insurance companies.
So covering all the bases.
Totally. By 2023, their pet care division owned something like over 1,500 vet hospitals and clinics, and they insured millions of pets through different brands you might not even connect to them.
1,500 clinics. That's enormous.
It is. It was a very clear strategy of serial acquisitions, buying up local and regional players to become dominant in both providing vet services and insuring pets.
And this one did finally catch the eye of regulators, didn't it, when they tried to buy Sage Veterinary Partners and Ethos Veterinary Health?
Yes, exactly. Those were larger deals proposed in 2021, and they finally triggered a serious intervention by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, in 2022.
What did the FTC say?
They argued that the Sage deal, in particular, would significantly reduce competition and potentially create local monopolies in some areas.
Right.
Lena Khan, the FTC chair, was quite blunt, saying the deal was illegal and could lead to higher prices and worse care for pet owners.
So what was the outcome?
Well, JAB ended up agreeing to what's called a consent order. They had to sell off some clinics in certain markets to preserve competition.
Ah, divestitures.
Right. And they also agreed to ongoing monitoring, basically needing FTC approval for certain future acquisitions. But, as the source material points out, this was kind of closing the barn door after the horse had bolted. JAB had already rolled up hundreds and hundreds of clinics before this intervention.
So the regulators only really jumped in when the consolidation became impossible to ignore?
Pretty much. And it's not just a U.S. thing. The U.K. has seen a massive rise in corporate ownership of vet practices, too. Even big companies, like Mars, the candy bar people, they've quietly bought huge vet networks like Banfield and VCA.
Mars owns VCA. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's surprising sometimes who owns what. So across the board in vet care, you're seeing this pattern. A few big corporate players, often private equity-backed, gaining huge control through lots of small incremental acquisitions.
Which, again, for you as a pet owner, could mean fewer choices, maybe less flexibility in care options, potentially higher bills down the line.
That's the risk, yes.
Now, sticking with pets, there's another angle. Pet retail. The story of independent pet partners, or IPP. Well, that didn't end so well, did it?
No, that one's kind of a cautionary tale about the roll-up model itself.
What happened there?
So IPP was basically a holding company set up by a different private equity firm, TPG. Their goal was to roll up independent pet supply stores.
Okay.
They bought up several well-known regional chains like Chuck and Don's, Chrysler's Natural Pet Places, known for maybe higher-end or natural pet foods. They accumulated around 160 stores.
Trying to build a national brand in that space.
Exactly. And again, each acquisition was probably too small on its own to trigger major antitrust concerns.
But it sounds like this rapid growth, likely fueled by debt, it caught up with them.
It certainly seems so. By 2023, IPP was reportedly struggling with a lot of debt and facing financial headwinds. They ended up filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
And what did that mean for the stores?
Unfortunately, it led to the closure of many of those local stores they had acquired just a few years earlier.
Oh, wow. So the roll-up failed and the local presence just vanished.
Right. It highlights a potential downside. These models aren't guaranteed to succeed. And when they fail, the consolidation doesn't just reverse. Sometimes the businesses are just gone, reducing consumer choice and access, especially to specialized products.
Yeah, that's rough. The local jobs disappear, the stores close. It's a real impact on communities, not just an abstract financial thing.
Okay, let's shift focus again. How about entertainment? Movie theaters. The source mentions cinematic consolidation. Ah, yes, the big screen. This is maybe a more familiar story for some people, but it fits the pattern.
How so?
Well, if you think back decades ago, there were many more regional movie theater operators. Over time, that landscape has been dramatically consolidated into just a handful of giant chains, particularly in North America. AMC, Regal, Cinemark in the U.S., Cineplex dominating Canada.
And that didn't happen through one giant merger, usually?
Not typically, no. It was largely through a long series of acquisitions of smaller theater circuits over many years.
Right. The source gives examples like Cinemark buying Century Theaters and Rabe Cinemas, or AMC swallowing up Carmike Cinemas.
Exactly. And in Canada, Cineplex became hugely dominant after it acquired its main rival, Famous Players, way back.
So incremental acquisitions building up market share.
Precisely. And what's interesting is, by the late 2010s, before the pandemic really shook things up, many major U.S. cities were effectively duopolies.
Meaning just two main companies controlling most screens.
Yeah, you'd basically have either AMC or one of the others like Cinemark or Regal dominating those markets. This happened gradually, often without major antitrust challenges to the individual deals.
And the potential impact on you, the moviegoer. Less competition on ticket prices, maybe fewer independent films getting shown.
Those are the potential consequences,
Yeah.
yeah. Less choice, less competition.
Mhm.
It's only more recently, especially with streaming becoming such a force, that people are looking harder at the effects of this long-term consolidation in exhibition.
So again, slow, steady consolidation over time, often under the radar. Let's go back to healthcare, which seems like a real hotspot for this. Anesthesiology Services USOP in Texas. This one sounds like a really stark example that actually did lead to regulatory action.
It is. It's a very clear case. U.S. Anesthesia Partners, or USAP, was essentially created by the private equity firm Welch, Carson, Anderson, and Stowe.
Okay.
Their explicit strategy was to consolidate or roll up anesthesiology practices, particularly in Texas.
Right.
And over several years, they systematically bought up practice after practice, including nearly every large independent group in the
Like
state.
rarely every large group.
Yeah. That's what the regulators alleged. And because each purchase was separate, maybe below HSR thresholds, it kind of went unnoticed initially from an antitrust perspective.
But the cumulative effect.
A cumulative effect by the late 2010s was that USAP became a dominant, sometimes the only, major provider of anesthesia services in large parts of Texas. And that raised serious concerns about rising prices due to this lack of competition.
So this is where the FTC and the Texas Attorney General finally stepped in.
Exactly. In 2023, they filed a lawsuit. They didn't just challenge one deal. They challenged the entire roll-up strategy itself as an illegal scheme to create a monopoly.
That sounds like a big deal legally.
It was. They argued USAP's series of acquisitions suppressed competition and illegally drove up the price of anesthesia, which affects overall healthcare costs for you.
And what happened with the lawsuit?
Well, rather than go through a lengthy court battle, the private equity firm, Welch Carson, settled the case in early 2025.
Okay. What did the settlement involve?
It included things like requiring Welch Carson to get FTC approval for certain future medical acquisitions, basically putting limits on their ability to do similar roll-ups in specific areas and limiting their control over USAP going forward.
So a significant intervention, but it came after USAP had already become dominant.
Right. It's significant because it was one of the first major U.S. antitrust cases directly targeting the private equity roll-up strategy itself, arguing the whole series of small deals was illegal. But yes, it took years for that action to happen.
Makes you wonder how many other medical specialties might be seeing similar consolidation. The source also brings up emergency room staffing, team health, and Envision, another healthcare angle.
Absolutely. This ties into hospital care directly. Team Health, which was backed by Blackstone, and Envision Healthcare, backed by KKR, noticed the private equity connection again.
Yep.
They both spent the 2010s aggressively buying up local emergency physician groups and also urgent care clinics across the country.
So consolidating the companies that actually provide the doctors and staff for ERs.
Exactly. They essentially took over the management of countless hospital emergency departments nationwide. And this consolidation, this lack of competition among ER staffing firms, was widely seen as a major contributing factor to that whole surprise billing crisis in the U.S.
Ah, right. Because these outsourced ER groups were often out of network for patients' insurance.
Precisely.
And with fewer competitors, they had more leverage to charge really high rates, leading to those shocking bills for patients.
That was the dynamic. Now, Congress did eventually pass legislation to tackle surprise billing directly.
Mm-hmm.
But the underlying consolidation of the staffing firms themselves, that largely went unchallenged from an antitrust perspective at the time it was happening. It's only more recently that the FTC has indicated they're scrutinizing these kinds of healthcare roll-ups much more closely.
So another area where consolidation happened first and the regulatory focus came later. Let's shift to one more sector that might surprise people. Funeral services. Park Lawn Corporation is mentioned.
Yeah, it's maybe not the first industry you think of for this kind of activity, is it?
Not really. You tend to think of local, family-run funeral homes.
Historically, that was very much the case. But companies like Park Lawn Corporation, which is Canadian but operates across North America, have been very aggressive acquirers since the mid-2010s.
How aggressive?
Well, Park Lawn went from just like 6 locations in 2013 to becoming the second largest provider in North America. They made something like 146 acquisitions just since 2019.
Wow, 146 in just a few years.
Yeah, cemeteries, funeral homes, rapidly buying up independent operators.
And again, presumably most of these were smaller deals, individually not triggering review.
That's the pattern. But the cumulative effect is, again, significant consolidation in this industry, which for you as a consumer could potentially mean fewer choices, maybe less personalized service, and likely higher prices during what's already a difficult time.
Right. The source mentions the company talking about margin expansion after acquisitions.
Which is often corporate speak for raising prices once you've bought out the local competition.
Okay, so we've seen this pattern now across so many different sectors: dentistry, vets, pet stores, movie theaters, anesthesiology, ER staffing, funeral homes. It's kind of staggering.
And the sources briefly mention others too: retail pharmacies, eye care clinics, insurance brokers, those Amazon sellers we talked about, auto dealerships, and parts suppliers. It's really widespread.
Which leads to the big question, why? Why did the existing competition laws, the antitrust systems in the US and Canada, fail to catch or stop this trend for so long?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? There's several key reasons, really.
Okay.
Probably the biggest single factor is the one we keep coming back to: notification thresholds.
Right, the dollar limits for reporting deals.
Exactly. In both countries, the laws were set up so that if a merger or acquisition was below a certain size, companies didn't have to tell the government about it beforehand. And many of these roll-up deals were intentionally kept small enough to fall below those limits.
So they could just fly under the radar, as the source puts it.
Precisely. It was a loophole, essentially, that allowed this incremental consolidation to happen without automatic scrutiny.
Okay, what else?
Then there's the historical focus, as we discussed, on individual mergers, not patterns. Antitrust agencies and courts traditionally analyzed each deal on its own merits. Does this specific merger harm competition? It was much harder, legally and practically, to challenge a whole series of small, seemingly harmless acquisitions, even if the end result was a dominant company.
It's like trying to prosecute someone for jaywalking 20 times instead of for one big bank robbery.
That's not a bad analogy, actually. Proving the overall anti-competitive pattern or intent from many small actions was, and still can be, quite difficult.
And I imagine the agencies just didn't have the resources to track everything.
That's another key point: resource and information constraints. Think about it, trying to monitor thousands of small, non-notified deals across dozens of different sectors.
Yeah, that sounds impossible.
It's a huge challenge. For years, agencies often lacked the data or the personnel to effectively track these sub-threshold private equity deals and understand the cumulative impact until maybe it was too late.
Okay. And even if they did spot a pattern, the legal bar for proving a monopoly is pretty high, right? Under laws like the Sherman Act in the US or the Competition Act in Canada.
Very high. You generally need to prove not just that a company has significant market power, but also that it intended to acquire or maintain that power through anti-competitive actions, and that this actually harmed consumers.
So just buying up lots of competitors isn't automatically illegal.
Not necessarily. You have to show that exclusionary intent and the resulting harm. That's a complex legal burden. Plus, there can be jurisdictional and geographic hurdles.
Meaning?
Well, many of these roll-ups create market power in local areas, like dominating the dental market in one city or vet services in another region.
Oh.
But the acquisitions are often done by national or international firms. So connecting the dots and showing harm across many different local markets, orchestrated by a single national player through deals that maybe didn't cross thresholds, it adds layers of complexity.
And finally, we probably shouldn't underestimate the savviness of the private equity firms themselves. The source mentions their strategic acumen.
Absolutely. These are sophisticated financial players. They often use complex corporate structures, multiple holding companies, different funds, which can make it harder to see the common ownership behind all the deals.
Right.
And they were strategic in which sectors they targeted. Often it was industries like, dental clinics, vet practices, funeral homes, maybe less politically sensitive, less likely to generate huge public backlash compared to, say, a big tech merger.
So a combination of legal loopholes, enforcement challenges, resource issues, and strategic maneuvering allowed these roll-ups to really flourish for quite some time.
That sums it up pretty well, yeah.
Yeah.
They operated in a space that the existing system wasn't really designed to handle effectively.
But it sounds like things are changing. Regulators are finally starting to wake up and maybe close some of these loopholes. What's happening now? What's the future outlook?
Yes, there's definitely a noticeable shift, particularly in the last few years in both the U.S. and Canada.
Okay, let's start with the U.S. What's going on there?
Well, under the Biden administration, the main antitrust agencies, the FTC and the Department of Justice, DOJ, have signaled a much more aggressive stance towards roll-ups and serial acquisitions.
How so?
A big move was the release of their draft 2023 merger guidelines. These are basically the agency's playbook for how they analyze mergers. And the new draft explicitly addresses serial acquisitions.
Oh, interesting. What does it say?
Guideline 8 specifically says that the agencies won't just look at one deal in isolation. They can and will look at a whole series of acquisitions by a company to assess the overall impact on competition.
So directly tackling that pattern issue we talked about.
Exactly. It's a formal recognition that a pattern of small deals can be harmful. Plus, we saw that joint public inquiry launched in May 2024, specifically asking for information about roll-up strategies.
Right, they're actively gathering data now.
They are. FTC Chair Khan has been very vocal, calling them stealth consolidation schemes. And we saw that settlement with Welsh Carson in the USAP case.
Requiring them to notify the FTC about future small deals in certain areas.
Right. That could serve as a template for future enforcement actions, basically, putting firms on notice even for deals below the usual thresholds if they've engaged in problematic roll-ups before.
Are there actual law changes being proposed too?
There have been legislative proposals discussed, yeah. Things like potentially lowering the HSR notification thresholds or giving the FTC more explicit power and funding to investigate serial acquisitions. But those haven't passed into law yet. The main action right now is through enforcement and guideline changes.
Okay, so a definite shift in enforcement posture in the U.S. What about Canada? You mentioned they've been active too.
Yes. Canada actually made some significant changes to its Competition Act in 2023 with Bill C-56. And some of these directly address roll-up concerns.
Like what?
One really key change is extending the time limit for the Competition Bureau to review mergers that don't require mandatory notification. It used to be just 1 year after the deal closed.
Not much time.
Not much time at all, especially to spot a pattern. Now they have 3 years. That gives them a much longer window to identify potentially problematic serial acquisitions and challenge them even after they've happened.
That seems like a practical improvement. What else?
Another big one was repealing the so-called efficiencies defense. This used to allow companies to argue that even if a merger reduced competition, it should be allowed if it created cost savings or other efficiencies. Getting rid of that defense makes it harder to justify mergers that might harm competition, including those that are part of a roll-up strategy. The amendments also give the Bureau more flexibility to consider things like overall market share trends and concentration levels when looking at deals.
So generally giving the Canadian regulators more teeth to look at the bigger picture.
That's the idea. The Competition Bureau has also specifically stated they're focusing on private equity roll-ups. And there's ongoing discussion about potentially closing loopholes related to how the size of the parties is calculated for notification thresholds.
Okay, so it sounds like both countries are moving maybe at different speeds or using slightly different tools, but definitely recognizing the problem and trying to adapt.
Absolutely. There's also broader talk, maybe more academic at this stage, about ideas like a specific serial acquisitions test. Like, if a company makes X number of deals in Y years in a sector, it automatically triggers a deeper review.
Interesting idea.
And regulators are looking more broadly at private equity conduct, not just the mergers themselves. And while it's legally very complex and controversial, you even hear some discussion about whether regulators could or should try to retroactively break up industries that have already become heavily consolidated through these means.
Wow, that would be a huge step.
A huge step, and probably unlikely in most cases, but it shows the level of concern is rising.
Okay, so if we were to sum all this up, it really feels like the era where these stealth monopolies could be built almost unnoticed through serial acquisitions. Well, that era might be facing some serious headwinds now.
I think that's fair to say. The strategy, while very effective for a period, is now under much greater scrutiny from regulators in both the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, the loopholes in the laws, especially around those notification thresholds and the old focus on just single deals, clearly allowed this trend to boom.
No question, they exploited gaps in the system.
But it seems like the reforms happening now and the ones being proposed are really aimed at closing those gaps, giving regulators better tools, more time, and a clearer mandate to tackle this kind of creeping consolidation.
Exactly. The legal and regulatory landscape is definitely shifting. Companies that have relied heavily on these under-the-radar roll-up tactics are likely going to find it a much more challenging environment going forward.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. It really does make you think differently about the businesses around you, the ones that feel local and independent, and the potential impact on your choices, on prices. It's significant.
It really is.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you, our listener, with. Thinking about all this, what other industries out there might be way more consolidated than they look on the surface? And what are the real long-term consequences of this hidden power shift for innovation, for prices, and ultimately for your choices as a consumer?
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth taking that closer look next time you're dealing with a local business and just wondering, who really owns this place?